afternoon, ladies and gentlemen from the C&E. My name is Geoffery Daybutch. I'm from Mississauga First Nation, which is on the North Channel of Lake Huron. And I've been asked to come here today to help speak of the Wampum bells and the Treaty of the Mississaugas of the Credits territory. I spent a good half of my life up in the Northern Territory learning about different agreements that were made, not only by the treaties that were signed, but some of the agreements that were made predating any of the European treaties that came along years later. Understanding that the elders who had this knowledge was they're leaving us slowly. So I have been able to understand this and reach out to as many of them as I possibly can. And in doing so, they've shared this wealth of information with me, and I'm here to share some of it with you today. Now, these wampum belts are agreements made amongst the peoples that all live in the lands here. This one is known as Chief Yellowhead's belt. Now, Chief Yellowhead is the person who had the belt. It wasn't really his belt. This is the belt for the council fires of the Mississauga Nation. And each diamond represents a different location in the council fire. Now, the purple backdrop, to my understanding, was representing the lands that we're living on. So, Turtle Island, the waters, everything, the resources that we're using, this is where we all live together. Now, the white path between the diamonds is connecting all of us. The first diamond represents a location near Sault Ste. Marie, an island in Lake Superior. And all of the leadership met with their communities and discussed the terms of what this agreement meant, and that they all identified as a Mississauga people. And that they all shared the same belief system, the same ceremonies were all sung, the same songs were sung, so they identified that they were all together. Now, the agreement was made, and they continued on down the North Channel, where they met near Manitoulin. And again, all of the people in that area agreed that they all were together, united, identifying as one group of people. Now, this diamond is represented with an animal that sits there as well. The animal is a fish with a white heart, and each location has a different significance. The third diamond is near the Midland and Penetanguishing area, and that council fire is also a part of this agreement. Now, they had all met with the peoples, and they all understood what they were all agreeing to, and that they were all bound together, and that's what the representation of the white beaded row between them is. They're all connected. The fourth diamond represents the Peterborough area, and the Mississaugas of Curve Lake, Mississaugas of Alderville, Mississaugas of Hiawatha, Mississaugas of Scugog Island are all a part of this council fire. The last diamond is right here in this region. This is Mississaugas of the Credits territory. And this council fire is represented with an eagle. Now, as I was saying, each one has an animal to sit with those council fires. The eagle was chosen for this area because it had to travel the greatest distance to bring messages back from the Southern Ontario region up to Lake Superior, where the Mississauga River starts. It actually feeds into the North Channel of Lake Huron, and we utilize the lands and resources from that area going straight into towards Lake Superior. Now, all of these land bases connect to each other, and it forms what we consider to be the Mississauga Nation. Now, a couple of years ago, the Mississaugas all met together, the 6 Mississauga reserves, and they signed what's known as the Mississauga Friendship Accord. And that is a document that the government recognizes now that can actually go along with that belt. Prior to any documentation, this is what we use to acknowledge our agreements amongst each other. So this friendship agreement now was drafted, and they all agreed that yes, we are Mississaugas and we all are a united group of people. So that is an incredible step forward in our interrelationships amongst each other. Now, after all the sovereignty has been made with this agreement in this belt, this came along, the dish with many spoons. Now, there's a lot of different things that people consider this, or they call it, and one is commonly referred to as dish with one spoon. Now, it's understood to me to be the dish with many spoons, and the dish itself is represented with this purple circle in the middle. Now, that represents our lands and resources and what we have to access, and that everybody had a right to access the hunting grounds, the harvesting grounds, and fishing waters, and nobody had ownership over it. Everybody has a right to access what they need from the lands. And the many spoons was to identify that many nations had agreed upon this. Not only the Anishinaabeg Nation, or the Six Nations, or the Wendat, there was many nations that all agreed. So the reference was that it was the dish with many spoons. Each nation had their own spoon to access the resources. Therefore, it's called the dish with many spoons. So, and the simplicity behind it is just the spoon in the middle and the dish with the white backdrop. And that was a very important agreement made by the people all around the Northern Ontario regions, with the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Hurons down towards the Tobermory region, as well as some of the nations who are in the northern states just south of the Great Lakes also met. They all met in Montreal. The Six Nations were a part of that as well. And everybody had this understanding that everybody had the right to access the lands and resources of the area. So that was a great understanding of the relationship that everybody had with the land. Now, there wasn't always peace between everybody there. So there was conflict between nations. Particularly one in this area that took place was between the Haudenosaunee, which are the Six Nations, and the Anishinaabeg Nation. And it had started during the Beaver Wars, when the Six Nations were expanding their territory and were displeased with an exclusive trade monopoly the Hurons held with the French. So I can imagine that the Six Nations had these fur trades that these stocks of fur that they couldn't trade, so this would have made them upset. Now, they did attack the Hurons, and Hurons made their way north to the North Channel, where I described the first couple of diamonds. Now, the Mississaugas in that region were very curious as to why are there these people from the south coming up into the Northern Territory, and they explained to us that they were being attacked by the Six Nations down in southern Ontario, and they were being driven out of their lands. So the Mississaugas in the North Channel agreed to help them launch a counteroffensive to go back south into southern Ontario, right back where we are today, to help the Hurons contain their land base. Now, after the war had ended and a peace agreement was made between them, this belt was used to commemorate that peace. And it is known as the Haudenosaunee-Ojibwe Friendship Belt. The large rectangle represents the Haudenosaunee, which are the Six Nations. They are the larger group. And the smaller rectangle represents the Anishinaabeg Nation, which consisted mainly of the Mississaugas, who marched out along with these council fires to reclaim the territory. Now, the white row in between them represents the road between both nations was free and open, and there was not a border between us. There was a friendship, and both were free to walk to each other's territory for trading and other, there's a friendship. So that is the significance of this particular belt. it could be considered as a type of peace treaty, I guess you could say. The dish with many spoons would be a type of charter of rights, you could imagine, I guess, a way of putting it in today's terms. And the council fire belt would be definitely a type of an alliance. So 3 different types of documents that were acknowledged by the people that lived in this area. Now there's other belts for different regions, for different nations that were that made agreements amongst each other, as well as inter-nation agreements. The ones that we have on display here today are ones that are primarily or that are acknowledged by Mississaugas of the Credit. This larger, elaborate belt represents the Treaty of Niagara. Now, this came after the Royal Proclamation. The Royal Proclamation happened in 1763. And before that time, there was a free-for-all with the trades in the First Nations. So people were able to trade freely with the chiefs or the leadership at the time. Now the Crown was trying to put a stop to this or gain some kind of control over what was happening. There's 3 nations that were here from Europe at that time. It was Spain, France, and England. They were all trying to get these treaties for the land surrenders at that time. The one particularly, the Treaty of Niagara, and the First Nations weren't really recognizing what these papers were, these documents that were being sent across from the Crown from Europe. And they found, I would imagine they would have been a great way to start the sacred fire for the sunrise ceremony when they had the negotiation. So I can imagine the representatives from Europe are watching them, wow, they just burnt up all of these documents that we brought for them. So they're trying to figure out what were they doing. Now the King of England was the smartest one out of all of them. He cracked the code. He said, they're making agreements with each other using these belts. This is their document. So he sent over a silver chain, and he called it the Silver Covenant chain. It's our friendship chain from the Crown of England to the First Nations here. And the First Nations now had this beautiful silver chain, this belt, that was very different from anything that we had seen before, but it was something tangible, something solid. It wasn't just these papers that were, good fire starter. It was something significant that actually had a story behind it, where it came from, what it meant, that this is a friendship between us. Now, if you see the links that they're holding, that represents the silver chain that was presented to them the year before, 1763. Now, if you see the year says 1764 on the edges, that was when it was ratified, when they agreed to it. And the belt was produced as another version of it. So when we close this belt together, the diamonds form a continuous circle. And that was to symbolize the friendship would go on forever, continuously. As long as both sides were holding on to that centerpiece. The 2 people are representing both nations. The First Nations having the white pure heart at the time, being willing to share the lands, the resources, and all the goods that were here, and the colonists with the black heart, with the greed at the time, which was very evident. So this was, a very important treaty for a lot of the First Nations, not only the Mississaugas, but all across North America as Canada began to grow. With that first treaty, the Royal Proclamation, that was land surrendered to the Crown. That land surrendering was also to ensure that there was a fair trade between the land transactions for the First Nations. And the Crown, they made what's known as the Indigenous Trust Fund, which is in existence today, and the Government of Canada holds this trust fund. This is where the First Nations get their treaty annuities, their healthcare funding, education funding, all comes from the monies that was put into that trust fund. All of the land transactions for each of those treaty areas is supposed to be going into the Indigenous Trust Fund. Now, if you can see the map that's further in the exhibit that has all of those land surrenders, all of those treaties, that's a lot of funding for the Golden Horseshoe, just one area. And the treaties aren't only meant to ensure the land transaction sales, but also the mineral rights and the harvesting rights, such as timber. There should be at least a portion of all of the profits from those minerals and harvesting rights going into this trust fund, which I doubt there is. I'm quite sure the corporations are pocketing all of the profits. Now, I hope that we do have lawyers looking into this currently. I'm pretty sure that we do, but that is actually where the indigenous peoples get their funding. It's very hard to explain this to a lot of people because they believe that it's coming from tax dollars and tax coffers, when in reality the buildings such as Queen's Park, Parliament Hill, the railroad was all built through funding somewhere. Where did the government of Upper Canada get funding for this? We're not sure. And the trust fund is quite a fraction of what it really should be today. So it's really interesting to see what's going to happen in the future with all of these reconciliation terms that the government's using. Now, after that belt had happened, a lot of things were changing for the First Nations. American revolutionists separated from the Crown, and they were going to try and take the city of York as well as the colony of Upper Canada. And during that war, a lot of the First Nation warriors were British allies, and they fought alongside the British loyalists. And after the war had ended, the Crown had recognized this, that a lot of warriors helped to defeat the Americans from taking Upper Canada. And a sign of friendship and acknowledgement of this, the Crown had this belt made up. And this is called the Pledge of the Crown. The intertwining lines are symbolically saying that both nations were intertwined at that time. There was intermarriages, there was soldiers fighting along one another, and there was the nation building together side by side. There was no difference between the colonists and the First Nations. They were all actually living as one people. So that was very, very significant for the Crown to do. The treaty that goes along with this, the written part, stated that the Crown they had asked Mississaugas of the Credit if we would surrender lands and resources rights to the Six Nations for their allegiance to the Crown. We agreed to this, and the Crown promised to give Six Nations 6 miles on both sides of the Grand River from mouth to source. They were given where the Six Nations of the Grand are sitting now. However, they were not granted any more land tracts after that. Now, a big part of the reason there was a shift in military strength after the War of 1812. Before the War of 1812, the First Nations had the military superiority. Now, many, many warriors died during that war, and we lost our superior strength. The British also lost many, many soldiers. However, the British had reinforcements coming across from Europe. They were sending shiploads across of soldiers and other people. We didn't have that same thing coming in. So there was a shift in military strength. Now, the British had recognized this, and the treaties began to deteriorate. The relationships and the residential school systems had come in. Now, a whole bunch of other things happened along the way, and before that even happened as well, the Toronto Purchase took place in 1805, and that was all kinds of controversy as well, having to do with signatures that were glued on after the fact, and the Toronto Islands claiming being incorporated, where the Mississaugas used these islands for ceremonies for centuries, millennia, and they never ever would have agreed to surrendering the islands as part of the land surrenders, being that we used the islands for the ceremonies. It wasn't a place to make settlements, it was a place to gather, meet, and have these not only ceremonies, but our meetings amongst each other. The ceremony is a part of that meeting, where we sit down and discuss the issues of the time. of these things had happened during the 1800s. The Williams Treaty took place about a century later, and that was a huge, huge issue for all of the First Nations around, because all of the hunting and fishing rights had been surrendered, and it just caused a lot of issues. So that's really all I have to say about the belts here today. I'd like to thank everybody for coming out. Geez, I've only covered about half an hour. I'm open for some Q&A if anybody wanted to ask questions. Yeah, yes.
Owns those belts?
Which ones?
Owns those?
Well, ownership of the belts is held by, like, these particular belts, they're held at the band office by the culture department. Now, they do come out to the exhibits with us. I'm fortunate enough to be the one who speaks about them frequently. I got to sit with elders. That's where I got all of the teachings for on these belts and how to interpret what they mean. I never actually went to any formal institution to get education. I went to ceremonies with elders, knowledge keepers, and I asked questions. Now, one of the benefits about engaging with people like you, great people here, is when you ask questions to me, sometimes I don't have an answer. And I'll go and look for that answer, and that helps me to learn even more about my own peoples and my own background. And engaging as many places I have, I've learned quite a bit now. So, like, I'm very open to anybody here. If you guys have any questions, I would really like to answer them if you guys had them.
The first belt that you showed us?
Yes, that was the Mississauga Council Fire belt,
What
yes.
was that put into it?
Honestly, I don't know a year. I do know that the Great Peace made at Montreal, which was the dish with one spoon, happened, the date written is 1701. However, they were meeting across all of the nations, all the lands prior to this being made. So I imagine they would have started negotiations for it around the late 1500s, when they would have started meeting and talking about the symbolism and what they were going to do before they held this great meeting in Montreal. That was a massive, massive meet of chiefs and leadership of the time, because of the distances that they'd all come from Lake Superior down to the northern states, all the way from the Atlantic coast, all came to see what this meeting was going to be about. And it was very significant when it was all agreed upon, what we could say ratified.
Thank you so much.
Oh, yes.
Very informative.
Something else I've noticed with this belt, I'm not 100% if it's true or not. People have asked the number of rows of beads, if that's significant, and I'm certain that it would be. The number, the rows, because there was a symbol behind all of this. Now, I do know that the 7 has a significance to the number of grandfather teachings, which are the banners that you see hung above us here. Bravery, love, honesty, humility, wisdom, truth, and respect. So, though I'm not 100% on that, I imagine that the 7 rows would have something to do with that representation and our teachings there. Another, like the first belt that I showed you, talking about the rows, the 5 diamonds are the 5 locations of council fires. Now, the purple rows, there's 5 rows of purple on either side. Again, I'm not 100% on the significance, but in my interpretation is that it represents the 5 council fire locations as well. Going along with the diamonds, there's 5 purple rows of beads. And the single row just represents the path between us and that we are all connected. Another interesting thing that I had heard just recently about these belts is all of these loose ends. The reason they were left open was so that other nations and other treaties could be added on and other groups could join into it. It was an open agreement that other people could join in. There was no cut off to it. You could continue going on and on and on. So that was another part of the learning that I've got to experience along the way.
Thank you. That was so good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for coming.
One more question.
Yes.
How early were the beads brought in?
Well,
Did come from Europe?
the beads were all handmade from here. They're made from quahog shells.
Oh,
And
that's
this
what
is the shell here that it's made out of.
So,
So the shell itself is no, this is actually from the ocean. It is in the Atlantic region, but it was traded for. Quahog shells. Well, they were brought over later. But we used for regalians. There was beads made out of bone, wood, the shells, as well as the quills